Well, we four have had lunch together on top of a hill about 30 miles from here, and we've been talking to each other about whatever came into our minds. All the things that came into our minds were delightful to all of us, so we talked about them in concert or separately or singly. But we came out more or less with the feeling that it might be desirable to talk about the future, dividing the pie up a little. And we thought that Bucky Fuller, who has been around in the future more than almost anybody else, I think more than anybody I've ever known, he's made very long journeys in it and has always succeeded in coming back, that he might talk a little about his voyages, about the ambiente, what you mean by future. Henry Steele Commager, known to me as Felix, has some strong views about what the future has deprived us of that we used to possess in the past in personal terms, in terms of human life. Jonathan Kozol, who is a former student of mine at Harvard and an old friend, has, as all of you know, faced the specifics of the move from where we are into the future, the specifics of education, particularly in the ghettos where it is hardest and dirtiest and, one hopes, most hopeful. And I might have a few remarks at some point, but we thought that we'd sort of begin in that order, that Bucky would begin, and then Felix, and then Jonathan, and then every man for himself. So Bucky, the ball is in your court.
Well, I have really deliberately been a student of total planet Earth, and I think I came to that from my Navy experience, where 3/4 Earth is covered with water, and there's only one Navy, the other one goes to the bottom, and the one that stays on top is concerned with the total line of supply and total world resources. I think that must have been what brought about my viewpoint. Anyway, for the last 50 years of my 82 years, I've been deliberately concerned with looking at total planet Earth, its total resources, the total accumulated know-how, and how we might use the total resources, metaphysical and physical, to the advantage of all humanity. I'd like to look at that as a ship. And in due course, I gave it the name Spaceship Earth, and that seemed to stick pretty well. Anyway, but my viewpoint then relates very much to, when it gets to future, the kind of viewpoint of the astronomer or the navigator dealing in celestial information, dealing in cosmic reference frame, and learning that, if I do really, by experience, learn how to build a ship, learn how to, by experience, how to what we call comprehensively anticipate what's going to be needed on board the ship for travel. That I've learned that by navigation I can also predict that I can get to certain places. So that the game of navigation in a ship was really one of dealing in futures. You build that ship with the idea of going to use it a year from today and what I'm going to use it for. So I've been used to that kind of future, from a very practical, hard mechanic sailor viewpoint. And I found in my early days when I began to try to apply what I learned with the sea, because the sea you had to float. In the airplane you had to you couldn't even float, you had to hold yourself up by energy expenditure. I learned a great deal about doing more with less, with the new alloys and so forth. And I began to look into what would happen if I applied the doing more with less, which was only going into weaponry, to the home front. And that's when you and I met long ago, in 1932, and you were doing the fortune story, and I had this lightweight structure. Today I have over 200,000 geodesic domes around the world, and they are one over the exact South Pole, and they're ringing the North Pole. They're where no other structure would go, and yet light enough to be flown into place, and yet delicate enough to let the microwaves go through, etc. So my experience is in those kind of terms, and I have deliberately then, during that last 50 years, been plotting how long it would take before you could, there was enough accumulation of know-how of doing more with less, where you might really be able to take care of everybody. And we've now come pretty much to that kind of a point. But I went off then into, now to education, the future of education. I found that I really had to re-educate myself. That what I've been taught at school, many things I've been taught at school, I could learn how to get the right answers for the examination, but I felt that just coming back to something you talked about, sir, at lunch, the straight line, which, as everybody said, the shortest is between 2 points, and you found it wasn't true except anywhere but science. And I said, not even true in science. Science discovers there's no straight lines, there are only waves. And we have complete discontinuity and so forth, so that I would say I had to re-educate myself very severely, because I had to get into technology of artifacts, because I'm going to solve problems by artifacts rather than by political reform. Became completely apolitical, and luckily, and therefore I've been really known as such. Therefore, I've been welcomed into the political camps, and all sides. They don't seem to feel any worry about dealing with me. Anyway, I have then had to learn to educate myself, and I've discovered that just such nonsense as you and I were taught about pi. And if you stayed in mathematics long enough, you were then taught that pi was transcendental, irrational, could never be resolved. You also taught that you couldn't design a sphere unless you used pi. I said, I'm looking at all this white surf out here, breaking all those white cresting waves. That's because it bubbles at different refraction of light. They're all little spheres. I said, how many places does nature carry out pi to as she tries to make it bubble before she discovers that pi can't be resolved? What point does nature turn out a fake bubble? I said, obviously she's not using pi. So long ago I had to reorganize I said, I don't think nature has a department of physics, a department of chemistry, and a department of biology. It has to have a department that had meetings to decide what to do when I drop a stone in the water. I think nature has only one department. So I really started out on a completely new self-education. And I'm really quite confident I really have found nature's coordinate system, by which I was able then to produce structures which weighed these out of the 200,000 geodesic domes around the world. They are enclosing space for given hurricanes and snow lows at only 3% of the weight of material for any alternate engineering strategy. So I really learned a whole lot about how to really structure. And I'm quite confident that one reason I have a very large following of young people today is that I have now found that humanity has the option to make it on our planet. That with the resources already mined and recirculating, with the knowledge already acquired, with using only proven technology, it is demonstrable by engineering design, just like the Power Project, clearly demonstrable with wide safety factor, that within 10 years, in the design revolution, you could have all of humanity enjoying a higher standard of living than anybody's ever known, while completely phasing out all further use of fossil fuels and atomic energy. And you don't get much of a hand when you talk about that. But this is really of interest to the young world, and so I feel that very great responsibility, because I am talking to the young world about, yes, we have an option ahead, and that, if we get there, it's going to be because humanity itself educates itself about having the option.
Would that be a wonderful place to stop for a minute?
Perfect.
Let Felix, who has some views slightly diagonal, say his say, and I'll stop you in exactly the same way.
Diagonal but relevant, I think. I'm impressed with the fact that you are talking about what used to be called natural philosophy. Time was when all learning was divided, and wisely divided, between natural philosophy and moral philosophy. And certainly at the time of Newton, scientific standards entered into the study of natural philosophy. They lingered on to some degree, but moral standards lingered on. One of the great problems of the current scene, a problem I think very much to the fore in education, but very much to the fore in politics as well, very much to the fore in the whole realm of what's called the social sciences, is that we tend more and more to think we can apply the standards and the habits of natural philosophy to the realm of moral philosophy. We think increasingly, at least the ordinary person thinks, that they can solve by scientific methods, they can solve by the use of the computer, they can solve by resort to all kinds of technical devices those questions which could only be resolved by wisdom and judgment, which is not a product, I think, of computers or a product of measuring by ordinary statistical standards. I think this is one of the great difficulties in education now. Mr. Kozel can speak of his experiences here, even in the elementary grades, whereas he has told us standards for the 6th grade must never be allowed to go into the 5th grade, and standards for the 5th grade must never be allowed to rise to those of the 6th grade, and so forth, because all this is laid out in computers. More and more it seems to me that our great decisions are being made not on the basis of judgment, not on the basis of the accumulated wisdom, not on the basis of those who, of reading of philosophy, of reading poetry, of reading novels, of learning about life, as one does learn through experience, immediate and vicarious, but of learning about life from accepted, standardized rules, regulations, principles, measurements of one kind or another in statistics. We no longer appoint judges to the highest courts of the land on the basis of the judgment of his peers. We submit his name to the FBI for elaborate scrutiny. We submit his name to the American Bar Association, which on the whole is run by mediocrities. We submit his name to a whole series of other technical investigations and come up with mediocrities, of course. We come up with people who are well-rounded, which means I've cut all the corners. That's the definition of being well-rounded. And instead of, we no longer therefore get the John Marshalls and the Storys and the Holmeses. We get men of, by good luck we get them sometimes, but in the last two administrations, as you know, we have not. And the same is true, I think, in one area after another. The grave danger is that we put our faith in techniques, in computers, in impersonal judgments, and surrender or abdicate the task of personal judgment. And this inevitably will, I think, give us mediocrity in almost every arena in the public affairs. It will not give us mediocrity in science, but it will in public affairs. And we must learn, I think, to return via philosophy, via poetry, via whatever you will, to return to the tradition of judgment. And of the English say that the purpose of an education is to enable you to know a good man when you see him. And I think as I look out upon the universities, for example, how few great presidents there are anymore. The age of Eliot, of Butler, of Harper, of Gilman, of the great university presidents has passed. And you pick presidents for their administrative quality after running 15 or 100 names through a computer. And the same is true in one area after another. And I think when we think of the future, we must try to go back to confidence in the judgment of the individual man, a judgment trained as largely as possible, not on technical studies.
Do I hear the end of a paragraph?
But on,
No.
oh, it'll be a long paragraph in that case, not on technical studies, but on human and humanistic studies. I will conclude this paragraph with the observation from Oxford when Rutherford was in charge of the Cavendish and made it the center of the research in physics of the whole world. One of his colleagues said, "Oh, I say, Rutherford, I say, you're rather riding the wave, aren't you?" And he said, "Why not? I made it, didn't I?" But you want his men who make the waves, and you can't get them by technical tests.
That really ends the paragraph.
Good. I meant it to.
Jonathan, it is for you to have a paragraph, as many as will take it.
Well, there are at least two different paragraphs and two parentheses where I know the start, but I don't know where the end parenthesis will be. But that'll be like Faulkner, so I guess it's okay. The last point, just I really wanted to pick up on what Bucky was saying, but just this last point seems so close to what I've been working at for the past 2 or 3 years. It's been so hard in public schools, wherever I go, to find students, whether it's in the 3rd grade or in the 8th grade or in the first year of college, who will say, I, will use the first person pronoun, say I, as the subject of the verb. I hope I'm not distorting the point you were making. It seemed directly suggested by what you just said. You can give foolish, well, ludicrous examples. Unfortunately, not foolish because they do exist. The 3rd grade teacher who refuses to say I or me. The child's rude to you, and you say, "Is that any way to speak to Mr. Kozol?" As if you're not there. That's professionalese in the education business. Is that any way to speak to Miss O'Brien? Instead of saying, is that any way to speak to me? You made me mad. It's like the abdication of your own right to speak in the first person pronoun, singular. And it's a lesson that I don't think is lost on children. Frankly, I think it's the first person plural, we, that the school boards are really alarmed about. But I think it's clear that people can't speak with the solidarity of the first person plural until they know themselves as individuals. So I think it's the first person singular we set out to demolish. And that's why we end up, I think, with so many people, not just the 3rd grade teacher, but the academic, the scholar who cannot get himself or herself to say, I've thought about this for 3 months and I have come to the following conviction, position, but instead, maybe at the strongest, you might get, I had a rather interesting notion on this subject. And the notion, in Cambridge especially, where I spend all too much time, notions proliferate, convictions are very hard to find because it takes a strong eye to espouse a conviction. So you hear people saying so often, one might well say, it could, I think, be argued by some fellows, there is a certain learned body of opinion that believes. It's very often you hear people speaking that way. Very seldom you'll hear someone say, it is my conviction that President Carter, for the first time in several years, has done something courageous on the neutron bomb, and I'm going to back him up and fight for it. Now, that brings us back to something we were talking about over lunch for quite a while. This whole phenomenon reaches an apocalyptic level when it's not the 3rd grade teacher, it's not the college professor, but it's the President of the United States himself, or hopefully one of these days herself, who is unable to see, not only unable to say, but unable to seem to feel that he, to use the present instance, is truly the first person, the I, who will make the monumental decision that will or will not accelerate the arms war, or else perhaps strike an historic reversal in this dreadful momentum that we've seen in the past 20 years. So, well, under President Nixon, it was very common to hear him saying, I am the president, as though he was frantically trying to persuade himself that he was. Even that he was, sometimes I thought he would say, I am Richard Nixon, just to try to persuade himself of that. But it was a complete loss of self. But now we have the situation of a president who I don't think people view with so much alarm, as at least as I viewed President Nixon, but and a man who has a chance, really, it seems to me, to make a mark in history, if he could find the courage not to defer everything for 25 consultants to come in and advise him and delay it for 6 months. And then, after he's talked with all the various experts, strike on a compromise position which won't offend anybody, but a man who might really make his dent on history, not by traveling to another previously odious nation, where we're running out of former enemies, like China. They're getting smaller and smaller, at least. After Havana, there won't be many more cities presidents can go to and repeat Richard Nixon's performance in Peking. But perhaps, you know, the really great stroke is not going to be that of the president who can go with a great entourage to Moscow or Peking or Havana for a friendly dinner or to play ping pong or whatever they do at those gatherings. But the president who is simply able to sit at home in the White House and say, I know that I am the president of this country. I know that I have it within my power to change history rather than to watch history, to be the subject of history rather than to be the object of history. And as the subject of history, as the subject of the verb, I am going to take a courageous stand, and I am not going to ask what the political polls say. I am going to create the political trend by the passion and the charismatic vigor and the blood and sweat that I invest in bringing the rest of the nation with me. To be as specific as possible and so that people will know exactly what I have in mind, is prompted by the present debate, which I think is one of the most important debates in American history. The debate as to whether we go on and construct a neutron bomb, which is just a good example of 3 or 4 other weapons we've discussed, the B-1 bomber and so forth. And that is the end of one paragraph. I'll have to come back to the other one later.
Yes, well, you'll have a, we'll pass this probably again. I have only one very brief observation to make about what has happened thus far. Bucky ended his remarks after talking about the extraordinary life he's led over the last, God knows how many years, 40, 50. I've known him for over 50. He ended by talking about a possible dream of the future which seems to him wholly realizable. Felix was talking about the necessity of keeping the human being, the human creature, the human mind, the human heart, the whole thing is summed up in human judgment, as an operative force in whatever approach to the future we make. Jonathan has been talking about a specific metaphoric presentation of this, the emphasis on the pronoun I, really urging, and I'm proud of him, that we cease to be afraid of ourselves. What I want to talk about, because I think we'll be moving more now toward the future, is, as I said, one rather small position. In order to talk about the future, you've got to have some sort of idea of where you now are. And the prevalent idea, as I read the press, the prevalent idea now is that we are in a very dreadful way, particularly in this country. Mr. Baldwin, a few days ago, discovered that we were really at the bottom of the pit. Everything is lost. Everything is going to hell in a hack. There is no end of insoluble problems which afflict us. Energy is an insoluble problem, at least so far as the Congress is concerned. It can't even face it. There are many others. Inflation is something that nobody has ever defined. No economist knows what it is. It's about to destroy us. There is the problem Felix was talking about, the problem of the of the neutron bomb, the problem of destructive weapons of this kind, this also is insoluble. And are we therefore in a distressful state? Well, sometimes it seems to me the view from the age of 86 is rather different from what it is earlier. You get to be, your eyes don't carry as far and you look nearer home. And as I look at this country now, I am astonished, as I always have been all my life long, whenever I've thought about problems of this kind, by the fact that we are composed as a society of human beings of an extraordinary number of admirable, humane people, decent people, likable people, stupid, of course we're all stupid, greedy, we're all greedy, but people who are amenable, who work. We are a working society. A great many people in this society suffer terribly, but we are a working society. We work quite well. I like Americans as I run into them, and I like them, and I think you would all agree with me about this, I like them better when I see them abroad. They're a marvelous contrast in most cases. We are a workable society. We have confidence in ourselves, and justly so, because we have a great past, and we also have the greatest revolutionary cause in the world. It is the cause which founded this republic. It's the cause of the individual. It's now obvious everywhere in the world, even to the addicts of the police state, that the police state is a disaster, that it is not for man, it's for the bureaucracy. We are a nation founded on the proposition that the individual human being is the integer that counts and works. And we believe in it, and we believe in it a great deal more since Richard Nixon. That disaster blew us back into sense. We believe in it a lot more than we have before. We now know that we are the great revolutionary people in the country, and that the Russians, under this regime, are not. So that I think taking the position, answering the question, where we are now, we are in the position to move into the future. End of remarks. Bucky, it's your ball again, or anybody's. We're not going to go around the circle. Whoever.
We're in a revolutionary position, but we're not revolutionary. We've lost most of our revolutionary drive. We are no longer innovative, either in the international arena or in the larger national arena. Nothing more sobering than the recollection that every major institution in American politics and constitutionalism was invented before the year 1800. Not one has been invented since the year 1800. The last great innovation in American politics was the Marshall Plan, to my mind. Since then, we have been sterile. We are against revolution around the globe. We are hostile to revolution and innovation at home.
You're talking about the government. You're not talking about
except
the
in the
people.
realm except in the realm of arts and in the realm of science. There we are not.
You're talking about the government and not the people.
The people make the government, however, and therefore we have sided. We are in effect what the Holy Alliance was, or what Britain was in the 19th century. We are on the side around the world of reaction, whatever we may be here, and unless we can slough off this alliance with reactionary forces which seem to fit into our interest and associate ourselves with the progressive forces of welfare and of internationalism that are stirring here and there on the globe, we will all meet the kind of disaster that the South met as of 1860, when it too set itself like flint against innovation, against criticism, against experimentation, and refused to go along with the future, which was a future of freedom instead of a future of slavery. We must begin, since we are the most powerful nation, and in many ways the greatest nation on the globe, we must begin by mitigating, by ameliorating nationalism, which is the greatest danger to the solution of problems that are worldwide that we now have. Unless we can take the lead in the amelioration of nationalism and all that goes with it in the way of militarism and chauvinism, we will continue down the road which will lead all nations to endless competition in arms and endless competition in other ways, and I think end in catastrophe.
Felix, you've made a wonderful case against the administration and a series of administrations. You've left out the American people, and you've most of all left out a whole rising generation of the Americans. The young are not what you've just
Well, I'm
described,
talking to
and you
them.
damn well know it.
I'm talking to them, not to the people in charge.
Good.
Yes.
All right. I'm taking up too much time.
I'd like to clarify my own meaning of the word nation. The word nation means a group of human beings who have been isolated geographically for many generations, where those who survive concentrate the genes of that type, and that is a nation. And Russia had 146 different nations where the people really look differently. America is the most advanced phase of crossbreeding world man. It always has been. In the ages gone by, the rafting era, there was a time when they came into Mexico from both across the Pacific and the Atlantic, and you have a complete mix in there. And so we're the most advanced phase of this mix. And therefore I do not talk about it as a nation, but a young world. When I find that young world all around the world, there was, as Arch will remember, President Eliot, when he retired from Harvard, startled the world by saying he was going to go around the world by commercial means with his daughter and his granddaughter and his wife. And the news followed him around. It was extraordinary. Today, every one of my students, I meet them everywhere around the world. They're all young worldians. They are crossbreeding world man. And that a very important thing happened to me evolutionarily in the following way. Historically, in mammals, the female has to carry the young, so she doesn't cover as much geography as does the male. Historically, human male was then the hunter, but it also brought home the news. He said what you could see from the top of the mountain and what the chiefs in the other tribes said. But all the young knew came from their dad and mom. They were the authority. And the way Dad said it was exactly the way kids mimicked. And he said it so badly, but brought about in many different languages. Anyway, suddenly we have this electron. And 1927, all the dads were coming home one night when the kids said, "Dad, come in and listen to the radio, man's flying across the Atlantic." And Dad never brought home the news ever again. And since that time, the kids saw Dad and Mom listening to the radio. So quite clearly, while Dad was authority at home, he was not the authority, he was listening to the authority in the radio. This brought about a completely new viewpoint of the young world, because they had no other way to parry that Dad was the authority up to that time. Then when the television came in, they gave much more. But anyway, the young people who were the first dissidents at Berkeley about the whole system at all, in the 60s, that particular group at Berkeley asked me to come and meet with them, and I did. They were born the year, the average was born the year the television came to American home and said, "Dad and Mom love me to pieces, I love them to pieces, they don't know what's going on. They have nothing to do with going to the moon, they have nothing to do with going to Korea. We've got to do our own thinking." I was brought up, and I still remember this, and so Mr. Cummings, I've been brought up, never mind what you think, listen, we're trying to teach you. The idea was that the young people were saying you were absolutely unreliable. But then suddenly we have a whole new evolutionary set of events where nature has accumulated enough information historically, and it's in the dictionaries, it's in the general inventory, where the young world does not have to depend on all, but really can get the going information and is going after it. I find the young world is absolutely intent today, abhorring any pretense, in love with the truth, making many mistakes, idealism being greatly exploited, but absolutely intent to make this world work.
Jonathan, you've got any views about that? You represent the young here, old as you are.
Younger. Well, I'm not sure. I really, as many colleges as I visit, many young people as I talk to, it's so hard to generalize. I am repeatedly so surprised. Places that are said to be hotbeds of passionate activism turn out to be half asleep. And then I go up to the Orono campus of the University of Maine, and 2,000 students turn out in passionate protest at building a nuclear reactor at Seabrook. So it's very hard for me. It's very hard to generalize safely. But I wanted to just come back to the earlier point that you're making, partly just now and partly when we were having lunch earlier. You're speaking of the you know, the enormous speed with which we travel, the fact that what once took 3 months, trip to Buenos Aires or trip to Copenhagen is now a matter of hours in person and seconds by telephone or radio or whatnot. And suddenly the world becomes as large as a room, as large as a spaceship, to use your term, or perhaps at least the size of a moderate-sized house with several rooms, but not much larger. And it's in that context that I look at one quality of public education, which, as Professor Commager and I were just discussing earlier, has really not changed a bit in a century and a half, or certainly over a century. And that is that schools today continue, as they did 100 years ago, to serve essentially the interests of their state, whatever that state might be, whether it's the United States, or whether it's the Soviet Union, or whether it's the Cuban state, which I just recently visited. It was very well summed up by the Minister of Elementary Education in Cuba, a very thoughtful and reflective man named Abel Prieto, who was asked at a conference in Rome last year, is it true, Dr. Prieto, that in Cuba the school is the instrument of the state? And he said, unflinchingly, yes, of course it is, just as it was before the revolution, and just as it is in Italy, in Canada, in France, in the Soviet Union, and in the United States, only always in different degrees and with different shadings and disguises. It seems to me that if we're thinking of the future now, when I look into the future, I like to look at least into the middle distance, rather than the farthest horizon, because if you look too far off, you sort of have the luxury of ignoring what's happening right now. So if we just look kind of into the middle distance, maybe 30 years ahead or 50, rather than a century ahead, I think we really could ask one blunt question. If we're talking to teachers or people involved in education, and that is whether the world can afford any longer to allow schools to remain the instrument of the state in a world which has become, as Bucky says, the size of a single spaceship, a small room, or a large house. It seems to me if we continue to give schools this nationalistic priority, that there is no way that no matter how much idealism Professor McLeish sees in the youth, and I agree that it's there in great floods and it surges forth now and again, despite that, if the school is so sweepingly devoted to the interests of each and every one of these 200-odd nationalistic entities that exist around the world today, then at the very least there are going to be hundreds of Vietnams. There are going to be hundreds of situations where one nation is going to destroy another, or at least, or as we did in Vietnam, almost a whole subcontinent of Asia. And at the worst, we're going to destroy the entire world. It's just to summarize it as briefly as I can, it seems to me that the danger is too great now. The world is too small. The bombs are too big, and I didn't realize this was going to rhyme, and the missile silos are too tall. For us to allow ourselves another generation of narrow, suicidal nationalism at the expense of just knowing ourselves as citizens of the world. And there must be some way we can reconcile this with the feelings that that you express so beautifully, and which I feel every time I travel anywhere in this country, that we live in a nation with millions of wonderful human beings, and to be proud of that, not to deny it, not to be ashamed of it, but somehow not to feel that our lives are any more valuable than those of 200 children in Vietnam.
Felix has got a...
Yes, but I return, has to do with education. I return to the final observation that Mr. Fuller made about the enormous change that came in with radio in 27, and I presume with television in 47. It should indeed have been an enormous change. We should have been able to know far more about the whole world than we ever knew before. We did indeed know far more about the world, and education entered in with courses in the grade school and the high school and world history and world literature with introduction of all kinds. What was the response? Was it a wise world policy? Was it an understanding of the right of the Russians to have their way and the Chinese to have their way and the Vietnamese to have their way? Not at all. After 50 years of education in other worlds and other civilizations, when we didn't approve of what North and South Vietnam were doing, our only response was to drop 7 million tons of bombs on them. That wasn't the response Jefferson had to problems, or the response Washington had when he warned us so solemnly against inveterate antipathies against any nation. This view was drawn from deep philosophy and a deep understanding of the rights of other peoples to experiment, not from a notion that we do everything and could impose our wills on others. Of what use is it to have all the extraordinary technical instruments for knowing everything, for having instant communication, for knowing instantly what is going on in every country, if our only response is a response that rejects judgment and rejects compassion and rejects understanding and consults only our own interest, as it has largely been in the last 25 years. It was not true in the Roosevelt administration. It has been increasingly true since the Johnson administration, the Eisenhower and Johnson administration. And in a way, here as in 100 other ways, we negate the advantages of the modern technological revolution, which should make us world-minded, international-minded, cosmopolitan in our views. But when we look at cosmopolitanism, where do we look? The 18th century. We look to Jenner. Scientists are never at war, said Dr. Jenner of smallpox fame. We look to Franklin, we look to Jefferson, we look to Condorcet, we look to Banks, we look to all of these international-minded people who said war must never interrupt science. War must never interrupt the intercourse of scholarship and of learning. Now we put all of our scientists in uniform, we put our universities in uniform, we corrupt them, we betray them by requiring them to serve the interests of national military programs, which is one of the gravest betrayals in the whole history of civilization. So that while we have all of these tools, we haven't got the judgment to use them right. That's the problem.
Trouble is also that I'm sure neither you nor I decided to drop bombs in Korea, did we? I certainly did.
Our elected representatives did. We voted for the people who did.
The people voted to drop bombs. I know
They did. They voted for the men who did it, and they didn't repudiate them at the polls. They elected Johnson. They elected Nixon. They knew perfectly well what he was going to do. And this is a democratic process. What other process is there in democracy but voting for those whose record is known?
For the first time in history, we really do have this very great remoteness of the individual and what goes on in Washington.
17 million majority for Nixon in 72.
You have to have enormous amounts of money to buy your way into election. There's no question about that. And anybody gets down the pressure cooker. The power of big money on Washington, the incredible amount of dealing has gone on. So I don't think the little individual...
Well, you're giving up on democracy.
The little individual is not really, the democracy is not operating at all. Right?
No, but if 17 million majority vote for somebody, that must be democracy.
Well, that's why I said before that no matter how... I feel odd disagreeing with my former teacher, but no matter how we shows that school really works on you. No matter how we try to blame it on the institution, the government, the CIA or whatnot, it's still the people who put those who make those instruments work. And you know, it's always struck me as bizarre that our press commentators devote so much attention to all the tactical errors that were made by Senator McGovern in his campaign for the presidency, as though he really deserved to lose because he made so many dumb mistakes, or because he chose a man who told him a fib or something like that. But it spends a little time addressing the extraordinary moral index this is of the type of judgment, of the products of classrooms in every state in the Union, from Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine. Somebody created that massive, don't mean to leave out Southern California or Texas either,
yes.
or the recently newborn Florida, but somebody put in one man rather than another, and to a certain extent, for all the foolish political errors that were made by the Democratic Party that year, it seems to me, if ever there was a choice between a symbol of earnestness and humanism, and a man with historical knowledge, a man who had been a teacher and with a religious, humane background, and certainly a devotion to the concept of a single world in which we had to live at peace, and a man who believed the very opposite of all those things. There was that choice, and I thought that was one of the most dreadful litmus tests of what we've done to our people in our public schools.
Well, Jonathan, can I ask the question? This would be asked of both Felix and you. Aren't you being a little more pessimistic than you need to be? First, I would yield to no man in my passionate support of the basic view that you both have. A conception of humanism has to lie at the center of any education, particularly science, or we're all lost. There's no question about that, and Felix has made that point eloquently. Where I differ from both of you a little bit is this. I don't think that the government is the only devil in the piece, although our government has behaved inexplicably badly for about 30 or 40 years. It is opinion in the body of the people. It is the body of the people. But I would remind you of something you don't need to be reminded of, which is that although we have not by any means won the battle for racial decency in this country, we have made an extraordinary progress, and this was made by people. It was made by Mrs. Rose Peabody among 2 million people, marching at the risk of her life and boils on her shins in the marches in the South. Thousands of Mrs. Rose Peabodys, thousands of people of all sorts and kinds. The opinion of the country has now totally changed. The misery among the blacks is not ended by any manner of means, and it may well be worse than it was. You know more than I about that, in the ghettos among the poor blacks. But nobody would dare get up and say before any considerable group of Americans anywhere, but almost anybody would say to you in Mississippi only 20 or 30 years ago. And the same thing is true. There are all sorts of issues in which we really have come of age. We have come to a recognition of the basic decency that we have. Don't you think so, Felix? You don't.
Indeed, on the domestic scene, it is true. Whether it's true in the international and world scene, I don't know. It seems to me the Cold War is still going on, and everything, the assumptions are still there that we stand at Armageddon and battle for the Lord. that Russia and communism stand for limitless evil and we stand for virtue, and that sooner or later this great conflict must come. We must abandon those assumptions, or the result will be catastrophe.
That was exactly the only postscript I would have made, was that I agree with you completely that there has been a drastic turnabout. I always add 180 too many degrees when I say this. I say a 360-degree change. I guess I mean 180-degree change.
I think
right?
you do.
I hope so. Anyway, in terms of public policy on the racial issue, I completely agree with you, with the exception of a few people who might as well go unnamed in the city of Boston. They're very...
Go on, let's name one. I'll name her if you
There's
don't.
no sense ripping the videotape, but I agree with you that in terms of public policy and what is acceptable, the change is eloquent, important, and irrefutable, and that's so. But sometimes I feel it's almost as though we've made a separate peace at home in order to consolidate ourselves, so that we could continue to wage war on the rest of the world.
Yes.
That's the fear I
One of the fruits
have.
of the
That's
Cold War.
unfortunately even more pessimistic, really.
We were told not to go on over an hour, and we're getting awfully close to it. But Bucky, would you have you got some?
I've just added a view that I think is very important, that all of the political ideologies on the planet are still operating on what seemed to be a scientific fact in 1800 to Thomas Malthus, that the first time economists had the total vital statistics around a closed system, spherical Earth. All empires up that time have been open planet going to infinity. The first time that you were dealing with a finite closed system, and Malthus said quite clearly the data is that humanity is multiplying itself at a geometrical rate, producing life support on an arithmetical rate. Humanity is designed to be a failure. Right on top of that, we have Darwin explaining his biological survival of the fittest. Karl Marx saying he agreed with both Malthus and Darwin, but he applied it to economics, and Darwin said he didn't mean it that way. But Marx said, I can see then the survival of the only fittest, nowhere nearly enough to go around, and the worker knows how to handle the tools and the seeds and so forth. Therefore, he is the fittest to survive. These other people are parasites. Other people say we're not parasites. We're obviously top thief because we are more qualified, better thinking, etc., etc. We have, however, each of the great world ideologies today is still saying, you may not like our system, but we have the fairest, most logical, most ingenious way of coping with lethal inadequacy of life support. Because there are those who disagree diametrically, can only be resolved by trial of arms, which system is fittest to survive. That's why $350 billion this year, for the last 30 years, an average of $200 billion, all of humanity aimed towards how to destroy us expertly. Now, I became aware at the turn early in this century that coming into with this electron and alloying, there was a new thing coming in, completely invisible, capability to do more with the same or more with less. And I began then to realize that it could be that someday we might do so much with so little, you might be able to take care of it. But if that was so, then the working assumption, all the politics by which it has to be partisan, has to be you or me, might be invalid. That's why I committed myself 50 years ago to prying the high technology to the home front. And so I have now, with the 200,000 geodesic drones around the world, I now know really what I'm talking about. So I now know it is actually feasible, I said, with the proven resources, with the proven technology, to take care of everybody at the highest standard anybody's ever known. Therefore, I now know that theoretically the political viewpoint is invalid. And this is something very, very new. You never have to rationalize selfishness again. You don't have to say, why my side is more blessed by God, or what it may be. So I don't see this really entering. But here I am now. I know this, and maybe I have a few thousand people really check me up and know that correct. But there are 4 billion human beings. They don't, in fact, 99% of humanity don't understand technology. They think technology is something to do only with weapons or competition with them for their jobs. They say, let's get rid of it. I know that we can get there, but it has to be a design revolution and not by a political or bloody revolution. We're operating only at 5% overall efficiency. We can get it up to 10%, means taking everybody this higher standard of living, which engineering agrees is very, very feasible. So I say that 99% not understanding technology, being against it, our chances of realizing our option to make it, to get around with a new chapter, humans on board of our planet, where we don't have to say, the hydrogen atom does not have to earn a living before it begins behaving like a hydrogen atom. That we really get around to whatever our function in the universe really may be, get out of the way, it has to be you and me forever. This is now optional. How can I get this to humanity? This is education. I want to know what my educational challenge right now is. How do I get to humanity? The understanding the spontaneousness. They themselves realize they have the option and undertake that. This is the future education if there is any.
Felix, will you say the benediction?
No, that you are
Oh,
you are the benedictor, as it were, benedictor, benedicator.
Bucky has already said it.
Yes.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much.
Good.